The courtroom was already alive with a quiet tension long before the judge entered, a tension made heavier by the confident posture of Daniel as he sat beside his high-priced attorney. He looked perfectly at ease, legs crossed, fingers resting casually on a leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Every detail of his appearance suggested control. Across from him, Anna sat alone. No lawyer, no files spread before her. Only a small folder resting on her lap and her hands folded tightly, as if holding herself together. Her simplicity drew attention in the worst way. Murmurs drifted through the courtroom, subtle but sharp, people wondering how anyone could come to such a serious hearing so unprepared. Daniel noticed too. He leaned back slightly and let out a short, mocking laugh, shaking his head as though the entire situation amused him. With a voice just loud enough to be heard, he made a remark about how irresponsible it was to face the law without proper representation. His lawyer smirked politely, not stopping him. The sound carried, and Anna felt it land like a slap, but she kept her gaze forward, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. The judge entered, and everyone rose, but the atmosphere didn't soften. As soon as proceedings began, Daniel's lawyer spoke with confidence, introducing himself and outlining their position with practiced ease. His words flowed smoothly, backed by authority and experience, each sentence crafted to sound decisive. When the judge turned to Anna and asked about her legal counsel, the pause that followed felt endless. Anna stood slowly, her movements careful, her face calm despite the pounding of her heart. She stated simply that she would represent herself for now. A wave of whispers rippled across the benches. Daniel couldn't help himself. He chuckled again, louder this time, shaking his head in disbelief. He glanced around as if inviting others to share in the joke, confident that the outcome was already decided. The judge shot him a warning look, but Daniel only straightened his tie, still wearing that smug expression of someone who believed power was permanently on his side. Anna sat back down, her breathing steady though her chest felt tight. Years of marriage had taught her this feeling, the weight of being underestimated, of being spoken over, of being treated as though silence equaled weakness. She remembered the countless moments Daniel had dismissed her opinions, laughed at her concerns, and reminded her, subtly and sometimes not so subtly, that he was the one with money, connections, and influence. Sitting there now, in a courtroom filled with strangers, the pattern felt painfully familiar. Yet there was something different too. Beneath the fear and embarrassment, there was a quiet certainty. She glanced briefly toward the large wooden doors at the back of the room, not with desperation, but with patience. She wasn't waiting for a miracle. She was waiting for someone who had taught her that knowledge could be sharper than arrogance. As the judge began to outline the case, Daniel's lawyer presented their arguments in detail, his voice smooth and commanding. He spoke about legal obligations, financial disputes, and alleged irresponsibility, painting Anna as careless and ill-prepared. Every word felt designed to overwhelm, to make her look small in comparison. Daniel nodded along, occasionally glancing at Anna to see if she would crumble. She didn't. When it was her turn to speak, she stood again, choosing her words carefully. She didn't try to match legal terminology or challenge every claim. Instead, she spoke honestly about her experience, about the decisions she had made, and about the reality behind the accusations. Her voice was steady, even if it lacked the polish of a professional attorney. To Daniel, it sounded naive. He scoffed, muttering under his breath, convinced that this was nothing more than a formality before his inevitable victory. Just as Anna finished and sat down, a sound cut through the room, the slow creak of the courtroom doors opening. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to draw attention. Heads turned almost instinctively. Footsteps followed, firm and deliberate, echoing across the polished floor. An older woman entered, her presence immediately commanding respect without a single word spoken. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her posture straight, her expression composed and focused. There was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty. A court officer stepped forward to stop her, but she calmly introduced herself, her voice clear and authoritative. The judge looked up, his expression shifting from mild irritation to curiosity. When she stated her name, recognition flickered across his face. Daniel frowned, leaning forward in his seat, confusion replacing his earlier amusement. He whispered something to his lawyer, but his lawyer had gone unnaturally still, eyes fixed on the woman now standing confidently in the aisle. The courtroom fell silent as she explained that she was Anna's mother and that she had arrived to formally represent her daughter. She presented her credentials without drama, documents already prepared. The judge reviewed them briefly, then looked up again. His demeanor noticeably changed. The realization spread through the room like a slow wave. This was no ordinary lawyer. She was a respected legal mind, someone whose work was studied, whose opinions carried weight even in retirement. Daniel's smirk vanished completely. For the first time that day, uncertainty crossed his face. The balance of the room shifted, and in that moment, it became clear that what Daniel had mocked moments earlier was about to become the very thing that would undo him. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed so subtly at first that only a few noticed, but within moments it felt as though the very air had grown heavier, charged with expectation. Anna's mother stood calmly before the bench, her hands relaxed at her sides, not clutching notes or adjusting papers like someone trying to prove themselves. She waited until the judge finished reviewing her credentials, her expression composed, almost patient, as if she had done this countless times before. When the judge finally granted her permission to address the court, there was no rush in her movement as she stepped forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was even and controlled, carrying effortlessly across the room without the need for volume. She began by acknowledging the court, then carefully restated the purpose of the hearing, reframing it in a way that shifted focus from accusation to examination. Every word felt intentional. Daniel felt a tightening in his chest as he listened, a discomfort he couldn't quite place. This was not the defensive, emotional outburst he had expected. This was precision. She addressed the earlier claims one by one, not dismissing them outright, but placing them under a clear, analytical lens. She referenced statutes and precedents with ease, her memory sharp, her delivery so natural it felt less like recitation and more like conversation. As she spoke, Daniel's lawyer tried to maintain his composure, but small cracks began to show. He adjusted his glasses more frequently, flipped through his notes with increasing urgency, searching for responses that suddenly felt inadequate. Each time he attempted to interject, Anna's mother responded smoothly, correcting a date here, clarifying a definition there, never condescending, never aggressive. It was as if she was guiding the court toward the truth rather than forcing it there. The judge listened intently, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking brief questions that she answered without hesitation. Anna watched from her seat, her heart pounding, not with fear now, but with something closer to disbelief. She had grown up seeing her mother like this, focused, unshakable, brilliant, but witnessing it in this setting was different. This wasn't just her mother. This was a woman in her element, standing firmly in a space that demanded authority. Anna felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of protection she hadn't felt in years. She glanced briefly toward Daniel and saw his confidence eroding, his posture no longer relaxed, his foot tapping restlessly against the floor. The man who had mocked her minutes earlier now avoided eye contact. His jaw clenched as the argument continued. Anna's mother shifted her focus toward the broader context of the case. She spoke about patterns, about consistency, about how isolated claims often failed to reveal the full picture. Without raising her voice, she began to draw connections between documents, timelines, and testimonies that had previously seemed unrelated. Slowly, a narrative emerged that was far different from the one Daniel's lawyer had presented. It was a narrative of control, imbalance, and carefully maintained appearances. Daniel felt heat creep up his neck as the implications became harder to ignore. His lawyer leaned in to whisper something urgently, but Daniel barely heard him. His mind raced, scrambling for a way to regain control, to return to the certainty he had walked in with that morning. When Daniel's lawyer finally spoke again, his tone had changed. The confidence was replaced with defensiveness, his sentences longer, more tangled, as if trying to bury uncertainty under complexity. He challenged a point, then another, but each challenge was met with calm clarification. Anna's mother did not rush to respond. She listened fully, then answered in a way that left little room for misinterpretation. The courtroom remained silent, the spectators captivated. Even those who had initially whispered about Anna's lack of representation now sat forward in their seats, Watching as the balance of power continued to shift, the judge called for a short pause, allowing both sides to organize their thoughts. As the court recessed briefly, Daniel slumped back in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by frustration and disbelief. He stared at the table in front of him, replaying his own laughter in his mind, the careless mockery that now felt painfully misplaced. His lawyer whispered reassurances, but they sounded hollow. Across the room, Anna's mother leaned slightly toward her daughter, placing a gentle hand over hers. The gesture was brief, almost imperceptible, but it carried more strength than any argument spoken aloud. Anna nodded, her eyes shining, not with triumph, but with gratitude. When the judge returned and proceedings resumed, the tone was unmistakably different. The court was no longer entertaining a performance, it was examining facts. Anna's mother continued with measured restraint, emphasizing responsibility and fairness rather than revenge. She made it clear that this was not about humiliation or winning for the sake of pride. It was about truth, accountability, and ensuring that power was not mistaken for righteousness. The judge listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. As she concluded her statements, the silence that followed was deep and heavy, not uncomfortable, but respectful. Daniel swallowed hard, realizing that the narrative he had relied on was no longer his to control. The courtroom, once a stage for his confidence, had become a place where his assumptions were being quietly dismantled, piece by piece, under the steady guidance of the woman he had never anticipated facing. When the judge invited further clarification, the shift in momentum became undeniable, as if the room itself had acknowledged that something irreversible had already occurred. Anna's mother stood once more, not rushing to speak, allowing the silence to do part of the work for her. Daniel's lawyer attempted to regain footing by reintroducing earlier arguments, but they now sounded thin, almost hollow, stripped of the authority they once carried. Each point he raised was met with careful listening rather than immediate rebuttal, and that patience seemed to unsettle him more than any sharp interruption could have. When Anna's mother finally responded, she did so by laying out a sequence of facts so clearly structured that even the spectators could follow the logic. Dates, documents, and actions were placed in order, revealing patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. As she spoke, she subtly redirected attention toward the emotional and practical consequences of those patterns, not as an appeal to sympathy, but as evidence of impact. She described how decisions made behind closed doors had affected lives in ways contracts could not fully capture. Her tone remained steady, but there was a quiet firmness beneath it, a reminder that the law was not meant to serve only those who knew how to manipulate it. The judge leaned forward slightly, his focus unwavering, occasionally asking for clarification on a detail, which she provided without hesitation. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had always believed that control came from preparation and resources, yet here was someone dismantling his position with nothing more than clarity and truth. Anna watched intently, absorbing every word. She felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, pride, and a subtle sadness for the years she had spent believing she was alone in facing someone like Daniel. The courtroom lights reflected off the polished floor as if illuminating the contrast between performance and substance. She noticed how Daniel avoided looking in her direction now, how his confident posture had collapsed inward. The man who once dominated conversations now seemed reduced to a silent observer of his own unraveling. When Daniel's lawyer rose again, his voice carried an edge of desperation. He challenged interpretations, questioned relevance, and attempted to shift focus back to technicalities. But the judge's questions grew sharper, probing the gaps in those arguments. Each response seemed to expose another weakness, another assumption left unexamined. Anna's mother remained composed, responding only when necessary, never overreaching. She allowed the court to draw its own conclusions, guiding rather than forcing, and that restraint made her case stronger. The judge called for another brief recess, this time to review the newly presented materials. As he left the bench, the room filled with hushed whispers, no longer mocking or judgmental, but speculative and impressed. Daniel sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his mind racing through possibilities that all felt increasingly bleak. His lawyer whispered urgently, flipping through pages, but Daniel barely registered the words. The certainty he had carried into the courtroom had dissolved into an uncomfortable awareness that he had underestimated not just Anna, but the strength behind her silence. Across the aisle, Anna's mother sat beside her daughter, her presence calm and grounding. She didn't offer reassurance through words. She didn't need to. Anna felt it in the stillness, in the unwavering confidence that suggested the outcome no longer depended on theatrics. When the judge returned, the courtroom rose once more, the ritual now feeling heavier with significance. The judge addressed both parties, summarizing what had been established so far, his tone measured and thoughtful. He acknowledged inconsistencies in the original arguments and emphasized the importance of context and fairness. Each sentence felt like another stone placed firmly on the side of truth. Daniel's lawyer attempted a final push, but it lacked conviction, as if even he understood the futility of resisting what had already become clear. Anna's mother responded briefly, declining to prolong the exchange unnecessarily. She reiterated that the purpose of the proceedings was not to punish, but to correct and clarify, to ensure that justice was not overshadowed by imbalance. The judge nodded, his expression resolute. As the session drew toward its close, the emotional weight of the moment settled over the room. Anna felt her breath steady, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in years. She realized that this was more than a legal turning point. It was a personal one. The narrative that had once painted her as weak and unprepared had been dismantled, replaced with one rooted in dignity and truth. Daniel, meanwhile, sat quietly, the realization sinking in that his mockery had been based on a shallow understanding of strength. The courtroom that once amplified his confidence had become the place where his assumptions were laid bare, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, unyielding power of clarity and experience. The challenge that followed was not loud or public at first. It arrived in the form of a private ultimatum delivered behind closed doors, wrapped in polite language and false concern. Her family summoned her to a formal dinner, one where every smile carried an expectation and every pause felt calculated. He was invited as well, though it was clear from the beginning that his presence was part of the test. As they sat at the long table, conversation drifted toward legacy, responsibility, and the image of the family, words chosen carefully to avoid directly naming him as the problem while making it clear that he was. When the offer finally came, it was presented as generosity, a financial settlement, a comfortable home elsewhere, and continued support for his daughter, all in exchange for a quiet divorce that would restore the family's preferred order. The room went still, waiting for his response. He felt the old reflex to accept, to step aside so others could be more comfortable, but before he could speak, she placed her hand over his, grounding him. For the first time, he saw anger flash openly across her face, not for herself, but for him. She rejected the offer with a calm that carried unmistakable force. She reminded them that her marriage was not a mistake to be corrected, but a choice she stood by. When they questioned his suitability, she spoke of character, of how easily wealth confused value, of how strength revealed itself in humility and consistency rather than bloodlines and balance sheets. He listened in stunned silence, realizing that she was fighting not just for the marriage, but for the life they had built together. The tension in the room thickened, years of control and expectation colliding with a boundary they could no longer cross. When they left that night, the air outside felt lighter, as though a storm had finally broken. In the car, neither of them spoke for a long time. Words felt unnecessary. The understanding between them was complete. The consequences came swiftly. Business partners hesitated, deals stalled, and pressure mounted from every direction. She worked longer hours than ever, determined to prove that independence did not require isolation. He took on more responsibility at home, not as retreat, but as support, managing their lives with quiet efficiency so she could focus on what needed to be done. Their daughter thrived in the stability of their shared effort, her laughter a constant reminder of what truly mattered. Late one night, after another grueling day, she confessed that she was afraid she had asked too much of him, that her world was too heavy, too demanding. He answered without hesitation, telling her that he had spent his life carrying weight alone, and that sharing it now did not weaken him, it strengthened him. The sincerity in his voice left her speechless. As the weeks passed, They found themselves leaning on each other in new ways. Decisions once made alone became shared discussions. Victories, even small ones, were celebrated together. Losses were absorbed as a team. The line between obligation and affection dissolved completely, replaced by something deliberate and chosen. One quiet evening, as they watched their daughter fall asleep between them on the couch, she admitted what she had been avoiding for months. She told him she loved him, not out of necessity or gratitude, but because he had become the person she trusted most in the world. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. He didn't respond immediately, overwhelmed by the depth of the moment, then finally told her that he loved her too, not because she had saved him, but because she had seen him when no one else had. The final test came when a public inquiry threatened to dismantle everything she had built, fueled by those who still believed her marriage was a weakness. This time, she did not face it alone. He stood beside her, not as a symbol, but as an equal, answering questions with honesty, refusing to be intimidated. When asked why he stayed, he spoke of choice, of commitment, of the belief that family was defined by care, not convenience. The narrative shifted. What had once been framed as scandal began to look like resilience. When the inquiry concluded, leaving her position intact and her reputation stronger than before, they returned home exhausted but unbroken. In the quiet that followed, they reflected on how far they had come, from a desperate exchange in a grocery store to a life built on mutual respect. The urgency that had once driven them had transformed into something steady and enduring. They had faced power, prejudice, and fear, and emerged not untouched, but united. What remained was not the story others told about them, but the truth they lived every day, a truth rooted in loyalty, courage, and a love that had grown slowly, honestly, and without compromise.